Welcome to Just Participation, a student-led global democracy podcast. This episode concerns best interest decision-making, which are decisions made on behalf of those who lack representation in decision-making processes. We are joined by researchers and practitioners, Dr. Lucy Perry, Dr. Melissa Levine, and Friedel Marquardt. Each guest is working in a different area regarding the topic: animals, children in the case study of South Africa, and the use of social media in response. Hi, Dr. Perry. Welcome to our podcast, Just Participation. We're very glad to have you here today. How are you doing?
I'm great, and thanks for having me. I'm also really happy to talk to you.
Me too, thank you. My name is Zeynep. I'm a research assistant at Participedia. And to start things off, could you also tell us a bit about yourself and your role as a researcher and practitioner?
Sure. So I'm currently a research associate at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, which is at the University of Canberra. And we are one of the partner institutions with Participedia. I'm also a research assistant with Democratic Society, which is a European democracy organization working throughout Europe with local governments, with other third sector organizations, and with citizens to enhance democratic and participatory infrastructure.
And what has been your engagement with Participedia and with the participatory governance cluster? What themes or issues have you been thinking through recently?
So I started working with Participedia back in 2016. And at the time I was living in Australia. I now live in Europe. And I was working as a research assistant. And what I initially started doing was cataloging and documenting the Australian cases of deliberative processes on the platform. And through doing that work, I got to be quite familiar with the range of cases and also the range of methods. And one of the things I was interested in is how can we use this crowdsourced data to do research? How can we use it as a data set? And I'm a qualitative researcher primarily. So I was thinking about how can we use the information that is there to do qualitative analysis. And from that, I went on to do a small research project about the impacts of deliberative processes, looking at a set of cases in South Australia. And there I started using the Participedia data really as, sometimes describe it as like a springboard into the cases, because it provides a central single access point to this really rich set of data. But sometimes that's not enough, and it can require further either primary or secondary research into those cases. So in that piece of research on impact, I started off using the case data from Participedia. And then based on that, I developed interview questions and I interviewed some of the organizers involved in those specific cases that I was interested in South Australia. And based on that, I co-authored a book chapter on the impacts of those processes with my colleague Selene Ercan, who's also based at the Centre in Canberra. And that should be out, I think, later this year in an edited volume on the consequences of democratic innovation. So that's one of the main ways in which I use the site. The other way I continue to use it in my daily work is, I guess, not through research, but I really use it as a resource to share with other scholars, practitioners, community organizers, the people in this much broader network who are interested in engagement, participation, deliberation. I really use it as a resource to highlight different cases and methods that are out there and the variety that is out there. And so I'm always, almost on a daily basis, sharing something about Participedia with somebody. So that's another way that I use it day to day.
And I wanted to continue the discussion with best interest decision-making, especially for those without agency. So what does best interests mean to you and the work that you do?
Yeah, so when I started thinking about this, when I heard you wanted to ask about this idea of best interest decision-making, I actually related it way back to my the research that I did during my PhD. So that was more about the representation of non-humans and other animals. And I was interested in how are other animals represented through discourses and decision-making processes. So I'm also part of the representation cluster in Participedia, as well as the participatory governance cluster. So, and I think on that question of the best interests, from my perspective and some of my colleagues, the problem is actually a lack of representation and or a lack of meaningful participation on behalf of those kind of affected groups and parties who might lack agency or currently not have their agency enabled or supported or recognized in decision-making processes. So I don't think we can do that advocacy of best interest decision-making on behalf of those groups without strengthening that their representation and or their participation.
And can we connect best interest decision-making to your other interests around deliberative democracy and democratic innovations, in addition to your focus on animals?
Yeah, so sorry, I should have been clearer there. So my focus there is on both of those things together. So I am interested in how deliberative democracy, deliberative processes, and other forms of democratic innovation could be able to enhance the representation of non-human animals and could really, how to say it, through representation, or it might even be pushing for direct participation, bring animals into democratic decision-making as almost like members of the democratic community. So something I'm working on at the moment is a new project. It's called Animals in the Room. And myself and a number of colleagues from different disciplines are interested in investigating the possibilities for bringing other animals into decision-making processes. So the basic idea is that other animals are deeply affected by lots of policy decisions, right? Agriculture, medical research, you know, food systems, lots of things. But in current decision-making processes, they are not really represented. So there is some kind of narrow representation of like animal welfare discourses might be present, some conservation discourses, but you really don't see the affected animals, like literally see them. So some of my colleagues think that humans really need to pay closer attention to other animals and recognize the fact that they actually have communicative capacity. Okay, maybe it's not communicative capacity in the same way as humans have, in the same way that humans can deliberate, but that they can communicate in ways that express their preferences and interests, so that if humans were able to pay more attention to that in decision-making processes, that could help them to recognize those interests and take those interests more seriously when making decisions that affect those animals' lives.
Okay, I see. And so this research really does expand our ideas about democratic governance. But what about standards of ethics within this context? How are they changing to reflect these different democratic movements?
So I think that, I mean, it's a big question. There's like a short answer is that I think personally, you know, standards of ethics for decision-making processes clearly need to be different when you're dealing with humans than when you're dealing with other animals for a variety of reasons. But I think the kind of challenge with this kind of question is that when we think about, well, what needs to be different, the problem is it can end up being a debate that kind of pitches human interests and non-human interests against each other, as if they're always, you know, as if there's always a playoff there, a direct playoff. You know, for example, so if you're making decisions about medical research involving other animals, it becomes the life of the human being saved versus the life of the animal being experimented on. And of course, you know, that does happen in some cases, but I think that my view is that for the most part, the reality is that many policy decisions that affect other animals are not necessarily about this direct trade-off. So if you think about the comparison of interests, it's not always life against life. So I think that in reality, there are many other animals whose lives and deaths are deeply affected by a lot of policy decisions, and they currently have very little representation. So I do think that any sort of ethical standards for human decision making need to be qualitatively different. But I also think that decision making processes that do affect other animals should be designed to support greater representation of their interests. And I don't see that greater representation or participation having to come at the expense of human interests, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes. And what can scholars and practitioners of deliberative democracy do? How can they uphold these standards of integrity when engaging in animal activism, animal welfare?
So you've touched there on another area of my work, which is about integrity, so the integrity of deliberative processes. And that strand of work is not currently related to my work on other animals, but I expect that in practice, these two themes will converge at some point. It's just that I haven't thought about that convergence yet. I imagine that some of the key issues could potentially be, and I'm kind of speculating a bit here, is that if we're thinking about animal activists, for example, or social movements, or in fact, any parties who are kind of interested and involved in deliberative processes, can sometimes be interested in how those processes can lead to their preferred outcomes. So they're interested in securing a specific outcome, but focusing on achieving that outcome can sometimes risk compromising the integrity of the process. So through, for example, trying to control the flow of information that the deliberating group receives. Well, no, we want them to reach this specific outcome, so we don't want them to hear about this other view. So that clearly compromises the sort of ethics standards or integrity of the process. But I don't think that that is something specific to animal advocacy or animal activism. I think it's specific to people that have a vested interest or a high stake in the process, no matter what the topic is. And I think it's potentially, you know, it's potentially more likely, and again, I'm speculating, they're potentially more likely to occur from more powerful players who have potentially more to lose from a deliberative outcome if it's not their preferred outcome, rather than animal activists who, and I've written about this in the past, who actually have very little power when it comes to decision making in these policy areas like agriculture, for example. Animal advocacy organizations and activists have very little representation and participation themselves. Before you even think about the animals, their advocates often have very little influence and power when compared to kind of animal use industries, say within you know, medical research or within agriculture. They tend to be much bigger players who have a much more powerful influence over decision-making processes. So I guess what I'm interested in is how deliberation can counter that power imbalance that's currently there, I guess.
And throughout this discussion, we kept coming back to the word qualitative. You also mentioned qualitative methods as one of your interests at the beginning. So could you also tell us a bit about your work in Q methodology?
Yeah, sure. So Q methodology is actually, it's a bit of a mixed one, because I would call it a at its heart, a qualitative and interpretive methodology, but it also includes a quantitative element. So it uses something very similar to factor analysis to cluster viewpoints together. And what Q methodology aims to do is, using this combination of quantitative and qualitative techniques, it helps to identify shared viewpoints on a topic, which can then be interpreted into discourses or shared perspectives on a topic. And I've used it on several different topics in my research, and I find that it can really help to kind of flesh out a debate, especially a highly polarized topic. So the first time I used it was on fox hunting debate. Now, fox hunting is a very controversial, very polarized animal issue in the UK, where I'm originally from. And using Q methodology to map these discourses helped to highlight a lot of underlying issues beyond the very polarized pro-hunting, anti-hunting viewpoints. So through using that, I was able to identify some kind of surprising moments of consensus across the pro and anti-hunting divide. And you really see how people interpret the same words and statements in very different ways, and it adds a lot of nuance and depth to the understanding of a topic. And I'm currently using that method to try and map shared perspectives on integrity as well. So the next study I do will map shared perspectives on the integrity of deliberative processes themselves. Yeah.
And since this allows us to flesh out debates, I'm assuming we can say that we can use Q methodology to study animal welfare of all sorts, right? Since you also worked on it in terms of fox hunting, this can be applied into many areas.
Yeah, you're right. And there's actually, it's interesting because it's a method that is used across many disciplines. So it's used across health sciences. It originated in psychology. It's been used in political science, across many different social sciences, in education studies, for example. So it pops up, but there are a number of studies covering animal and conservation debates. So it has been used quite extensively there. And again, as you said, it really helps to identify, I think what it's good at doing is identifying underlying values that might not surface from something like a survey that maps, say, preferences on fox hunting. That might not get to the kind of underlying core of why people disagree over these animal issues, because what often happens, especially in a highly politicized debate, and maybe this seems obvious, but I think it's worth saying that those disagreements over animal issues are very rarely about the actual animal issue. They're frequently conflict over human values, and Q methodology can kind of bring that out.
Mm-hmm. And with regards to our discussion as a whole, what do you expect or want the future to look like?
Oh, again, big question. Can you be more specific?
It could be in terms of animal welfare, deliberative democracy, democratic governance. What would be like your utopia in terms of this? What would be your preference? What would you like to see in the future?
Okay, so let's think maybe about, I'll go broad, thinking about participatory governance. And that's probably because I've read in the past 2 days 2 great new articles about embedding participatory governance. So I think one of the things that democratic society, the practitioners that I work with, emphasize, which really kind of hits home for me, is the idea of building democratic infrastructure. So I think in my kind of early years as a PhD student entering this field, I thought about deliberative mini-publics and processes as processes. And often in practice, they were one-off processes, or they were, essentially they're projects, and projects are inherently limited in terms of the long-term impacts and capacity for change. So I find it really useful to kind of contrast that with thinking about the idea of building this long-term democratic infrastructure. And what does that mean? I think it means creating and enabling and supporting and sustaining multiple forms of both civic engagement, which might be initiated by governments, as well as supporting an ecosystem of bottom-up, citizen, people, community-led approaches. So that's one aspect of it. I think it also means realizing and implementing those engagement and participatory processes at multiple points throughout a policy cycle or a policy process, because it feels like at the moment they're kind of top loaded into the kind of agenda setting or consultation or policy development formulation, and there's less later on when it comes to implementation and accountability and evaluation. And I would like to see those participatory and deliberative processes evenly spread throughout the policy cycle, and also at kind of multiple levels of government as well. I think that's really important. I think that sometimes a lot of this action is happening at local levels, which is great because authorities are then have a closer connection to the publics that they're working with, and some of those local policies can have more tangible impacts on people's lives, but they can also be kind of constrained by national level, funding restrictions, policies, and so on. So I think there needs to be coordination vertically as well. And I think that those things all combined together help to build that infrastructure. But that really is it. And maybe that really is a utopia.
No, thank you. That was really helpful. And are there any final thoughts you would like to leave with us?
I think maybe the only other thing I would mention, which I didn't mention earlier, is how I have used Participedia in kind of teaching and learning, but it doesn't really relate to the topics that we talked about.
We are a podcast related to Participedia, so if you like, you can definitely talk about that. We would be interested in that.
Okay, so I've used Participedia in teaching, not so much in teaching courses myself, but in collaborating with other colleagues who are teaching students about democratic innovations, democratic governance. And Participedia, I think, enables students to kind of explore democratic innovation and its whole plurality of different meanings in different contexts, and also find what resonates with them in the context that are meaningful to them. And I think that's really powerful as like a learning tool. So it can be things like students exploring the site and finding something that means something to them, or writing a case themselves. And there's also like practical benefits of gaining research and other academic skills there. So next week I'm going to be running something which I decided to call the Democracy Lab with some high school students in Italy, where we're going to start really big by thinking about what is democracy to them, and what do they think the value of democracy is or not, and what do they think are the threats to democracy. And then I'm going to introduce them to the site and just ask them to kind of explore it at their own pace and see if and how they find anything that can help address any of those much bigger questions that we're going to talk about. So that's something I'll be doing next week, which I'm looking forward to. But yeah, I think it's a really valuable resource for teaching in that regard.
Thank you for your participation, Dr. Perry. We also look forward to it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Dr. Levine. Welcome to Just Participation. Thank you for joining us. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and your role as a researcher and practitioner?
So I'm disciplined as a social scientist, although African studies gives me the opportunity to be a little bit ill-disciplined, which is just lovely. My academic trajectory hasn't been very linear. I've kind of moved in and out of academia. So I did my first degree in the early 1990s at the University of the Witwatersrand, or WITS, in Johannesburg. And then went back to school to do a master's, which I did at Edinburgh in Scotland, then worked again and came back to do a PhD. So my work in between my academic in between my academic life has been for mostly actually thinking through questions of democracy and working through ideas and questions of democratic practice. So I've worked for the National Union of Mine Workers, for instance, where my work focused on specifically on ways in which mine workers could access the new rights that were opening up under democratic South Africa. I worked at the African National Congress, where my work focused on strategy for elections. I was the director of strategy for elections. And that also took me into consulting for a variety of left organizations across the African continent and in other parts of the world on elections. And then finally, I mean, I don't know if this is democratic or not, but I did do work in New Africa Investments Limited, which was a publicly listed Black empowerment company. And we were looking at ways then of expanding, I suppose, democratizing capital, if capital can be democratized at all. But, you know, there was a moment when we thought maybe it could. So, yeah, and now I teach at the University of Toronto. So you can hear I come from South Africa, right? You can hear that in my accent.
And what has been your engagement with Participedia and the human rights cluster? What themes or issues have you been thinking through?
So Participedia, I joined as a collaborator, which is hilarious for me because, you know, again, coming from an activist background fighting against apartheid, the word collaborator has a very terrible connotation. So, you know, so I've had to twist my head around what collaboration means in a positive sense. So I joined as a collaborator and now co-chair the human rights cluster, which is really wonderful. There's a diverse and really interesting group of scholars who are doing such important work. So yes, so I co-chair human rights with Professor Ibowo. And in terms of the work that I'm doing, that work is on truth and reconciliation commissions. This work has done so much important work on. And I've been thinking, and I've been interested in thinking through TRCs as nationalizing instruments, but specifically on the effects of those, of nationalizing, in the sense of how we remember colonialism, right? So when we nationalize truth commissions, we limit the scope of remembering. And then that limits the capacity to produce just outcomes for those who don't live in national borders, but are affected by those colonial practices. And also on rising xenophobia. So the extent to which truth commissions, by asserting the national community, actually land up playing a role in reproducing, you know, questions of inclusion and exclusion, of belonging and exclusion. So that's top of, you know, that's top on my list, on my to-do list at the moment. And you know, but in addition to that, and I suppose linked to it, in some ways, my work, through my work, I think of the notion from Sennett of remembering well. He calls it remembering well, which is about the ways in which memory gets shaped by the neoliberal present, right? So remembering well then suggests that we need to remember well beyond that neoliberal present and its limitations. And I also use the prism of traveling colonialisms, which I borrow from Clifford's Traveling Cultures, as a way to think about the connections between those people and those spaces that have been colonized historically, and thinking about colonization then as both a universalizing project, right, in the sense that, you know, colonialism travels, but also one that relies on division, divide and rule, you know, and that is articulated through nations, through national borders. Waiting in the wings, and we're going to start getting onto the specifics of some of the stuff that I think you're most interested in. So waiting in the wings are issues of concern around democracy in the university, which of course, you know, this is our workplace. So, you know, we have to be, if we're activists for democracy, if we're researchers for democracy, we have to contemplate the spaces within which we work. So democracy in the work in the university, and specifically thinking through pedagogies, anti-racist pedagogies, democratic pedagogies, pedagogies of mutual aid, right, in relation to this concern for democracy and democratization. And then finally, I'm really obsessed with children and their rights. And this is going to be a project that's I'm hoping to begin in the summer months, where I see, you know, children and their rights as a significant limit to democracy, in the sense that, you know, democracy is limited to the political sphere. Liberal democracy, or neoliberal democracy even, is limited to the political sphere at the moment in a kind of representative mode, but it's undergirded by these institutions that are deeply authoritarian, like the workplace and like the family. And it's in the family that you have these characters, these children who, you know, we expect one day to be democratic citizens, but they're raised in these really authoritarian spaces.
Could you elaborate on what you mean by the work of memory? How is memory political?
So do you want to speak a little bit about best interest in relation to the work of memory, or should I just talk about, it's okay, I can speak about either.
Because we wanted to relate your research to our topic for today, which is best interest decision making. So yeah. I wanted to connect how the work of memory and your focus on children connects to that. So for that, I wanted to ask to give a bit of context on what work of memory is for our listeners.
Yes, of course. So when I talk about the work of memory, I actually prefer to talk about the politics of memorialization in a collective sense. And the reason why, you know, I think language matters, or kind of conceptualization matters in this respect, is when we talk about memory, we often think about a subject and an identity, a singular identity. So when we speak about collective memory, what we do in our analysis is we kind of transform the collective into the singular identity, right? So the kinds of words and ideas and concepts that we use participate in the kind of making of the collective, right? And often that's inadvertent, because as scholars, we don't want to be nationalizers, but we do, right? It's kind of, you know, in some ways is part of what we could understand as like a nationalizing methodology, right? Where we, you know, so when we speak about a collective memory, we assume the collective that has a memory. So instead of thinking about the work of memory as such, I think to us this kind of active in respect of representation to make meaning, right? So in that sense, memorialization is really contested, and what is forgotten is one thing, but also the meaning that is associated with what is remembered and what is forgotten is deeply political and even ideological. And in many ways, I think memorialization and, you know, the kind of the study of memory becomes so key in the 21st century, because we seem to have dispensed with ideology as a construct, and in its place comes memory. So in some ways, I kind of bring ideology back into my scholarship by bringing memorialization into the scholarship. So when I think about collective memorialization, I'm thinking about deeply political practices that we think about in relation to the past, and how we frame that which has happened in order to understand the present, to legitimize what happens in the present, to justify it, or to contest it. So memorialization practices for me are really about, justifying or contesting present conditions.
And since now we have the context of what memorialization means, could we also connect that and perhaps your research on children to best interest decision making? So what does it mean to the work that you do?
Yes, so I haven't historically used this prism of best interest. So it's really interesting. It's really interesting for me to apply it to the context of memorialization and in particular to children. So the importance of best interest is that, it's a protective strategy. It's a strategy that seeks to protect the most vulnerable and advocate for the most vulnerable. And so that's really, that's really key, and that's really important in the legal sense. In the political sense, what we need to think about is then the extent to which best interest can be applied in an infantilizing way, right? So when national leadership stand up and tell us that it's in our best interest that they do A, B, C, D, can be infantilizing. So best interest in the political sphere, I think, needs to be as a kind of starting point for a conversation, for deliberation, not the end, but rather inform our approach to an inclusive and democratic practice. Right. In other words, we don't want to limit democratic practice simply to a kind of representation mode where I represent the best interests of, but rather where you kind of have common interests, public goods that are generated through, an engagement and a kind of participatory environment. So, so I'm just thinking in relation to the work that I've done on memory, particularly in South Africa. So, if we just, if we kind of began and ended at best interest, then, the history of our transition, of the transition in South Africa becomes quite, it's quite problematic. So, according to the conditions of the time in the early 1990s, you basically had a situation where Njabula Ndebele says, the National Party concedes defeat at the very moment that the ANC can't declare victory, which means that we're in a stalemate. And on the basis of that analysis of the stalemate, we have political elites who measure what's going to be in the best interests of the country on the basis of that stalemate. So we had institutions like the Truth Commission, for instance, emerging. You also have, so in relation to my work, you have a memorial practice that was conditioned by the logic of democratization rather than a logic of decolonization, for instance, right? So democratization, so instead of smashing symbols of apartheid, they get incorporated into the memorial edifice of the country. So you have new memorials then that diversify the landscape, right? So that becomes the language of the moment. What this has meant is that you have a kind of legitimacy that's given to those figures of apartheid. So in fact, today, actually, funnily enough, on this day that we have our interview, on the 6th of April, 1652, how many hundred years ago, Jan van Riebeeck arrives in the Cape on behalf of the Dutch East India Company, where he begins the process of colonization in what later becomes South Africa. And that process of colonization included the dispossession of land from indigenous people, the violent dispossession of land from indigenous people, and also the importation of slaves from Asia. Right, so the importation, enslaving people from Asia, bringing them to what becomes South Africa, and also, beginning colonialism. Now, by the way, Jan van Riebeeck's statue still stands in Cape Town, at the end of Adderley Street, not far away from the Democratic Parliament. So, you know, so what does this mean then for kind of memorial practice, and specifically as it relates to best interest? So in relation to best interest, we had a transition that didn't become this, you know, this kind of bloody battle as everyone was expecting. Although, by the way, the transition wasn't a peaceful transition, but it wasn't, you know, it didn't become this kind of violent race war that was expected, right? But what it did produce is this kind of molding of 350 or so years of colonization as a historical conflict, naturalized unequal relations of power, of poverty. So a best interest principle operated here in the sense that everyone needed to have a stake in the new country, but best interest in the political sphere is clearly then not neutral, right? And produced outcomes that in the immediate term might have been the best outcomes, but in the medium to long term have been really problematic. So how does this relate to children? You know, latest figures from South Africa, by the way, you know, I'm focusing my unit of analysis is this nation state, right, is South Africa. And I'm trying really hard to in my work to start thinking more regionally as opposed to just within the nation state. But nonetheless, for us right now, you know, in respect of children and best interest. So we have a legal edifice in South Africa since 1994 that is really quite progressive, even in relation to children, right? Much more progressive than Canada, where I sit right now, in the sense that, you know, teachers and parents are not allowed to hit their children, right? This is corporal punishment is outlawed in South Africa. You know, whereas I think in Canada, if I'm not mistaken, you as a parent, I think you're still allowed to hit your child. There are all rules around how you should hit your child, but nonetheless, you're still allowed to. In South Africa, you're not allowed to. So, you know, in terms of best interest principles around protecting children, we have a legal edifice that is quite progressive and thoughtful, but we have an everyday practice that is quite brutal and cruel. So the extent to which children are abused in our country is, you know, is extreme. And I was just reading figures on the number of children, the number of babies born to children during COVID in South Africa. Well, in Gauteng, Gauteng's the province where Johannesburg and the capital city of Pretoria are. It's the most populous province in the country. And between March or April 2020 and March 2021, 23,000 babies have been born to children under the age of 18. Okay, so, you know, the statistics will tell you that they're teenagers, but they're children. Legally, they're children under the age of 18. Even worse is that within that figure, almost 1,000 of those children, of those babies, have been born to girls who are 14 or under, which of course constitutes rape, right? So it's not just that these children have had babies, but these children have been raped, you know, because there are, you know, there are laws, again, protecting girls 16 and under from sex. So this legal edifice that is profound in terms of its, you know, best interest principle in relation to girls, but the reality is profoundly different. And this is where, you know, legal solutions to political problems are not adequate. Now, that's not to say, okay, let's dispense with the legal edifice, not at all. But that legal edifice is just a start. It is not even close to the end. So 27th of April will mark Freedom Day. which is 28 years since the end of apartheid. And you still have thousands of schools in South Africa that have pit latrines, you know, as toilet facilities for children. Now, you know, this is in a country that doesn't need to have pit latrines for children. This is in a country where all children should have access, and we can afford to have access to, you know, to proper facilities at schools. Since about 2014, 2 children have drowned. 5-year-old children, little children, have drowned in those pit latrines at school. And a few others have been seriously injured in these pit latrines, either almost drowning or the walls have collapsed on them and they've been seriously injured. Now, while it's, you know, it's a handful of children who this has happened to, it's one child who drowns in a toilet is one child too many, and it's absolutely unacceptable. So again, we have a legal edifice that suggests best interest, but we have an environment that really is neo-apartheid.
Can memorialization be used in South Africa, especially when giving voice to children who are humans without agency, or those who historically have not been given the right of self-representation?
Yes, so I mean, I think so. I think absolutely. You know, given the kinds of examples that I've just spoken about, I think it's so important that, you know, we understand the present conditions under which children live in relation to that so-called past, right? Because I'm calling it that so-called past in the sense that, you know, I don't think we can draw a line under 1994 and say that was the past and this is the present. I think we really are living in conditions that are, you know, neo-apartheid or neo-colonial. And, you know, and so in that sense, the normalization of the impoverishment of children, the normalization of, you know, 1,000 babies born to 14 and under girls is just unacceptable. And the only way in which we denaturalize this is if we understand, you know, the context in which it's produced, that we don't take this for granted, that we see this as being quite a deliberate manifestation of human intervention, which requires a deliberate intervention by, you know, by those same humans to transform, that we have to actively engage in this, you know, in this circumstance. So in that sense, I think, you know, memorialization is key. You know, that it's not just some kind of, you know, how Africa is often read as just incapable of A, B, C, D, right? So incapable of, and it's important to understand the ways in which the continent, or, you know, in this case, South Africa, has been produced to be incapable of. And so the capacities to, you know, the capacities to transform, then I think if we are remembering well, would require us to not to tinker at the edges of a system, but really to quite fundamentally transform it in the interests of the most vulnerable, you know, who in this case are children, and are, you know, and are racialized, are Black children and are poor children. You know, so there's obviously there's a class, and you know, there's ways in which children in South Africa are racialized or classed, that we obviously, and gendered, as I've said, that we, you know, we really have to work through.
Since you also mentioned racialized and gendered children, what dilemmas do scholars and practitioners face when studying working memory, but considering its racial, gendered, linguistic, or even class-wise limits?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, the ethics of this work, I think the ethics of any scholarship have to be uppermost in our minds. You know, you know, there are lots of scholars who've done work on kind of extractivism in scholarship. And I think that we always have to be mindful of that. I mean, I've kind of, the cop-out for me has been, which I think is probably a cop-out, has been to, in my studies, I study the powerful, right? I turn my gaze on institutional practices, as opposed to, you know, the subjects of, you know, of the policies, or, you know, the actual people who are negatively affected by, or positively affected by the policies, by the institutional practices. So, you know, that's kind of been my cop-out way of dealing with very difficult questions. I mean, the minute that you have any actual people that you're engaging with in your research, you absolutely have to ask who this research is for, why you're conducting it, who does it belong to at the end of the day. You know, do you even attach your name to a collection of narratives, for instance, that you know, you've sat down with other people to produce? You know, there's so many. I remember in my first degree, a very, very important scholar in South Africa had done this work on women in this rural village, and the book was written in her name, although all the interviews were conducted by her research assistant, in the researchers in the acknowledgements as the research assistant, but the author, the book. And so I remember from a very early age, you know, in my studies, this recognizing this problem, that, you know, I think if we also think about democratizing practices of scholarship, you know, then we can think about, we can decenter authorship, right? And understand the co-production of knowledge, as opposed to knowledge being kind of singularly produced by some experts. So yeah, so I think even more so with vulnerable populations, you know, when we're doing this kind of work, which, I mean, especially in the context of that kind of situation of violence, you know, of rape, of, you know, of infrastructure that is decayed and impoverished, you know, when children are living in those kinds of environments, you know, I mean, I think that the planning for your research in terms of the kind of ethical questions that you need to ask, you know, you can't do that alone. Even, like, it also again needs to be done in collaboration with others. You need to be able to speak back and forth about the expectations, the limitations, what you can and can't do with that kind of research, and how you don't want to reproduce trauma for children, you know, in the kinds of work that you do. You can't re-traumatize them. Yeah.
Yes, and can you also speak to the reliability of conducting such studies with children, especially considering that their working memory is even more limited, especially considering these limitations that you talked about?
Right. So, I mean, for me, you know, so again, for me, the question is not memory as such, like as a psychologist would do memory on trauma, or, you know, what we know is, you know, people who have, you know, people who've been raped will have, you know, their memory will be affected by the trauma. So the work that I do is not on kind of individual subjects in that sense, right? I mean, I think there's such an important role to be played by the psychologists and the psychiatrists in respect of understanding trauma as it relates to the individual subject. My work looks more at, you know, the politics of memorialization generally. My gaze is towards the powerful with a view to transforming power, I think we take for granted power as this thing that exists. But I'm hoping in my work that my work to some extent already does this, but will continue to do this, is really challenge the very notion of power as a structure through which humans organize themselves.
And speaking of your hopes, what do you expect or want the future to look like?
Oh, right. Yes, so it's such,
It's a general
yeah, I
question,
mean,
yes.
it's such a difficult question, and it's a difficult question not just because social scientists don't know how to predict the future, even though we insist that we do. I often tell my students that we're very good at kind of a retrospective prediction. So we can retrospectively look at something and predict the outcomes because of the conditions that we can see, but prospectively we struggle with prediction. And then also I think that the kind of neoliberal moment that has been produced in the, from the late 20th into the 21st century also kind of stops us from imagining the future, in the sense that it created an end of history, right? That was its logic, was that we would be living in this perpetual present in a way, that the future is certain because there's no alternative to the present. So there have been so many ways in which I think our imagination has been constrained. And then with the climate crisis, right, the way in which then the future gets imagined is in quite dystopian terms. So, so when you ask me what the future should hold, I mean, I'm a parent, and so, I can only be hopeful because, and I'm a teacher, I suppose. So we can only be hopeful. But, I kind of draw from what I draw from when I'm miserable about contemporary politics. I draw from this really important work that is recent on decolonial feminism by Verhès. And I'll quote from her if I can, because this goes to my work on memory too, because she talks about temporality. So I'm going to quote from her, because I think that this is ultimately how I think we need to see the future. So she says, Verhès says, I take a stance against a temporality that describes liberation only in terms of unilateral victory against the reactionary. Such a perspective shows an enormous condescension of posterity towards those who are defeated. Writing history this way turns the story of oppressed people's struggles into one of successive defeats, imposing a linearity in which any setback is taken as proof that the fight was badly conducted, which is of course possible, rather than one that exposes the determination of reactionary and imperialist forces to crush any dissent. This is what songs of struggle, Black spirituals, revolutionary songs, gospel songs, songs of slaves and colonized people recount: the long road to freedom, a never-ending struggle, revolution as daily work. It is this temporality that I situate decolonial feminism. So for me, like when I read that, my heart soared, because it captures so well this idea that this antagonism to kind of Big Bang stuff and this recognition that the struggle continues, right? That we can see these glorious events and they can mark something for us, but they can't mark the end. Again, it's back to kind of end beginnings. They don't mark an end, but they mark an opening, right? So if I read South Africa in that sense, then I can't be disappointed with the trajectory of freedom, but recognize that moment with the collapse of formal apartheid suggests an opening for struggle. So in that sense, a luta continua, the struggle continues.
That was a very insightful and hopeful response for the trajectory of apartheid as an opening instead of a closing. So thank you for your participation. Hi, Friedel. Welcome to our podcast, Just Participation. We're very glad to have you here today. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thanks. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor to be here.
To start things off, can you tell us a bit about yourself and the work you're doing as a PhD student?
As you said, I'm a PhD student. I'm at the University of Canberra in Australia. My PhD topic explores if and how social media use can empower marginalized communities. And I've got a specific focus on the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests here in Australia, which had a huge resonance amongst First Nations people in Australia, especially around the issue of First Nations deaths in custody. And this topic very much stems from my interest in democratic engagement and learning from new or previously unheard perspectives, as well as challenges to the status quo, and then the role that social media can play in this.
And what has been your engagement with Participedia as a research assistant for the Participatory Governance Cluster? And what themes or issues have you been thinking through?
As a research assistant in the Participatory Governance Cluster, I guess my main role in that space has been about supporting the great minds in that cluster and the Participedia team in phase 2 of the global project. In the great meetings that we've had and co-design workshops, we've explored various aspects of participatory governance, and it's also spaces where I've shamelessly just been soaking up the knowledge that's been shared by the cluster members in many of these spaces. And so I guess the main theme that the cluster has been thinking through is democratizing democratic innovations. Now, this is a big topic, but it's a really fascinating one, in that we're questioning what democratic innovations actually are, what they promise to do, and how they deliver on that, the actual politics involved in them, and the context these democratic innovations take place in, as well as then the broader state and challenges of democracy surrounding these innovations, and many more threads in regards to that. I guess in essence, there's a lot to consider here, but cluster members, they've done a lot of work in these spaces, and so they've been bringing a wealth of knowledge to these discussions. And I guess as part of this, or related to it as well, I'm also part of the Deliberative Integrity Project team at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. And in my role here, I've been using the Participedia platform to analyse Australian cases of mini publics to inductively identify markers of deliberative integrity in real life practice. And so this has been a really fascinating task as well.
And to start our general discussion for the episode, what does best interest decision making mean to you and the work that you do or hope to do?
Oof. This is a very big question, and it can go in many directions. But I guess to me, best interest decision making is something that considers the interests of a group of people who may not be as present in democratic spaces as others, but whose existence and needs are valued just as much as the other groups who are at the table, so to speak. And in relation to my research, or the research that I hope to do, is that this ties in with giving voice to marginalized groups in political spaces and ensuring they are heard and their interests are legitimately considered in decision making. And this takes intentionality, especially if these groups are not widely represented in these political spaces. And so measures need to be put in place to listen to these groups and understand their needs and interests in order to make the best decisions for them.
You talked about giving voice to groups. So could you also elaborate on how best interest decision making connects specifically to the power of social media and how we can give them a voice through social media?
Social media it's an interesting beast. It's something that can both empower and do a lot of good, but at the same time also hinder and cause a lot of damage. And I guess I personally oscillate between loving and hating it multiple times a day. But one of the things about social media that I think ties into best interest decision making and giving voice to marginalized groups is its accessibility, in that almost anyone can use it to share their stories and perspectives. It's a channel and platform that's readily available for this, and it's something which I think is empowering for groups and individuals who have felt unable to share or to express in other, perhaps more traditional platforms and channels.
And in addition to empowering marginalized communities, can social media also give voice to humans without agency, or those who historically have not been given the right of self-representation?
That's another big and a very loaded question. I think to an extent it can, but I think to really be able to answer that question, we would have to speak with people who consider themselves in these groups and to hear from them to say, is this a platform where you feel that you can share and that you are actually heard and responded to by engaging in social media in this way?
Yeah, it was a very general question, but maybe to focus it a bit more, can you give examples of this, maybe from your work on Black Lives Matter or movements by the First Nations peoples in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm yet to do my data collection in this space, so what I'd be speaking of is quite general as well. But it's a lot of, I suppose, what I've seen just from preliminary research and searching is that social media allows for self-expression and in a way that the people who use it want to express it themselves. And so we've seen that a lot with First Nations in Australia, in that there's a huge celebration of First Nations identity and family and culture and many things. And this is something that we don't always see, say, through mainstream media or other platforms. There's often a focus on certain aspects, sometimes even negative aspects. But the thing that has been very apparent in social media is that celebration of culture and identity, and really bringing in different perspectives, challenging dominant narratives that have been quite harmful. But yeah, yes, I'll leave it there.
And in addition to this research on social media, we also wanted to talk about your work on discourse and narratives. Can you tell us a bit about what that means? How do they influence the way people perceive and interact with reality?
Yeah, so other big issues there. I guess, yeah, discourse and narratives are really fascinating, I find, in that they really do influence perceptions of reality, as you were saying in the question that you asked. I guess to kind of explore, to put parameters on what I'm sharing, the way I interpret narrative and discourse is that narrative is a broad overarching story or idea of something, whereas discourse is the conversation that stems from or feeds into that narrative. And so the discourse is, I guess, the tools that people use to reinforce or negate, or as I said earlier, to challenge a narrative. It's very powerful because it frames the way an issue or a topic is presented. So this is narrative, and that has a huge influence on the political and social spaces, because how people perceive things is often how they respond to them. And so if a narrative, I guess, that has been harmful or has been causing certain responses in certain ways is challenged, causing people to look at something differently, then that would, in theory, cause a change in responses to that.
To build on that, you talked about how it allows us to challenge a narrative. So can we relate that to maybe accountability within the political sphere, within decision making?
So thinking of social media in this space and the discourse that takes place on social media, if we look at certain political decisions or things that have happened in political spaces, we can often turn to social media to see how people respond to that and the discourse that then takes place around that decision. And we especially see this with, say, broken political promises, in that people, they express their rage or anger on social media, and then yeah, in response we sometimes do see politicians or people in political spaces respond to that either through commentary or yeah.
What should activists or people on social media be careful about when it comes to representing marginalized groups that they are not a part of, whether it be in terms of ethics or just things to be mindful about?
Yeah, this is really interesting, and I think it comes back to understanding the issue, especially if it's about a group that a person is not a part of. So I think there's a lot of I want to say danger, but I don't know if that's the right word for it. But yeah, we need to be careful if we're speaking on behalf of people that we don't necessarily share the same history or culture with, because we bring our own biases and understandings and perceptions of reality to it as well. And this may not be the same as the culture that we're speaking on or about. And so when it comes to representing marginalized groups that we're not part of, I think real care needs to be taken to make sure that we understand what it is, like the issues that these groups care about and advocate for, and really consult with members of the group for this, to be in continual conversation about that, to ensure that that understanding remains and isn't just something that we've read somewhere that we're speaking into. Yeah.
The reason I ask this question is in one of your articles, if you are not a member of the marginalized group that you're talking about, you acknowledge that first and then start asking questions. That's why I wanted to ask if there could be some bigger lessons connected to this. What is the purpose behind your mindfulness? Because I can even quote from what you wrote in your article, where you said, "I am still finding my way in the space that my understanding of First Nations issues will remain limited." And I found that to be very interesting. That's why I wanted to ask your opinion on why are you being so mindful about this?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up in that way. Yeah, and I think, yeah, that's something that I've personally, I suppose, wrestled with a lot, because I'm very aware of my own biases, but I'm also very aware that objectivity is something that kind of eludes me, because I'll always be bringing certain perspectives into an issue based on just personal things, personal upbringing, personal experiences, and all of that. And so personally, I want to be very careful in how I treat the knowledge of other people, especially groups that I'm quite different from, but really interested in. And so yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm still finding my way in, and that's also a way to, I guess, acknowledge that I will be making mistakes, but please be gracious to me. And yeah, and so I think, gosh, if I am answering the question and not just going off in tangents again, yeah, there needs to be a real care and concern and value of the people and the groups that we engage with in the space. And I guess this comes back to best interests decision making as well. It's ensuring that that these groups feel heard and listened to, so that the measures and the approaches taken to the research or decision making or anything else is done with the best interests in mind of the people we're engaging with.
Thank you for that. I'll ask you some pretty general questions today. This is the last general question, I promise. What do you expect or want the future to look like?
Oh man, this is really big, and it's really hard to answer as well, given the last few years of just
Maybe we
some more
can
voluptuousness.
maybe we can focus it on social media if that helps a bit.
No, but
Okay.
that's all good. No, I think, oh gosh, it's really hard to say. But I don't know, I'd hazard a guess that that we might see increased political engagement by social media, just because I suppose in the last 2 years, like we've all been, like everybody's been impacted by this one big thing. So we have that thing, like with the one big thing being the pandemic. So we have that thing in common, and people have contributed to the really big conversation about that online in various ways. So I guess in one way, I think I'd expect the future to, regarding social media, for there to be more political engagement in that. Yeah, and I guess yeah. It's a big question.
No, I agree. Yeah, I definitely agree. So just to wrap it all up, to bring it back to Friedel, are there any final thoughts you would like to leave with us, or maybe any work with Participedia that you'd like to spotlight? Anything that you want to draw our attention to?
Oh gosh, I think, yeah, well, I suppose one of the things that I've really appreciated and valued about Participedia, and this also relates to my research, is the spotlight that that the platform puts on marginalized and I guess unheard political engagement and initiatives that take place, and that is something that I often see Participedia share in its Twitter feed, in that it spotlights what a certain group is doing somewhere in the world that we may not have seen before, and that's something that I think is really, really great.
Exactly. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you for listening to the second episode of Just Participation. Stay tuned for the next one.